way or there will be trouble.
Of course, machines can't think as people do. The machine is different.
Being, what marvelous being! How gratifying! How gratifying!
Thank you, everyone. By the way, I'm an experimental psychologist. I'm not a clinician, and so most of my comments on that, on this film, and some of the things that I would like to present to you, are not necessarily from the basis of a clinical psychologist. I work in the area of behavioral neuroscience, and use, look at preclinical science, basically.
We can't hear you.
How's that? You were saying that? Yep. Good. All right. Thank you. Okay, so go ahead and get started. I just want to have 3 points of interest here. A little background on Philip K. Dick, and he has if you've read the book, he has a very interesting author's note at the end that tells us a lot about what his intent was with this book and the content in Richard Linklater's film. We'll, of course, talk about the fictional drug substance D and make some points about that and relate that to current drugs that exist out there that may be like that, may not be like that. There's nothing quite, the story, really like substance D out there. And then just talk about some differences within some of these concepts where, Philip K. Dick has basically taken he was right on, as you'll see, in terms of knowing the science of the time. This book was written in '77, and how he took that further to make an interesting case to bring awareness to this issue. So here's Philip K. Dick. He was born in 1928. He lived in Chicago. He lived most of his life in California. He was a very renowned science fiction writer, a recipient of the Hugo Award, but relevant to this film, in terms of his personal life and the things that I was able to find, he was very open about his drug use. He claims that he was addicted to amphetamines through most of his early career. He said that he could write 70 to 100 pages a night on amphetamines, cranked up on that, and so he had that type of behavior in terms of his writing and otherwise. He did go into rehabilitation voluntarily in 1973 in Canada. This is where he conceived of the concept of substance D and started writing A Scanner Darkly, which was published in '77. He died in 1982 of heart failure related to a stroke. I wasn't able to find anything about his death there being related to a drug overdose. As far as I know, he wasn't using drugs at that time. But important to point out. So here is the author's note. These are the first 2 sentences. This is at the end of the book. And this is what he says. This has been a novel about some people who were punished entirely too much for what they did. With this metaphor of the street, they wanted to have a good time, but they were like children playing in the street. They could see one another, of them being killed, run over, maimed, destroyed, but they continued to play anyhow. And that last statement there, again, this was written in '77, and that is a concept that has remained as a concern and as a part of a definition of drug addiction. And so we can see a couple of different ones. Here's the statement, but they continue to make decisions to use the compound amongst very bad things starting to happen in their lives. And you can see this is from the DSM-5. The essential feature of substance use disorder, that's what they're calling it, in there is a cluster of cognitive, behavioral, and physiological symptoms indicating that the individual continues to use the substance despite the substance-related problems that continue to happen. Further in the author's note, he includes himself now, and he says, I was like the rest of them. I was playing, and I was severely punished. And this sentence, which comes later there, in reference to this, he's telling us, and nature cracked down on us. And as a neuroscience experimental psychologist interested in this area, that says something very specific to me, not sure to you, but This punishment, I think, that he is talking about are the changes that happen when an individual goes down the path that is inducing all kinds of physiological changes, and the substrates, that are changing that are producing the behaviors of addiction. Here's another statement of what drug addiction is. This is a person in my field. This is the George Koob. I'm not sure if you can see the reference. It's not on here, but this is from George Koob, and he is now the director of NIAAA. He's devoted all of his career to studying the neuroscience and physiological substrates of these behaviors. The underlying part is added to the concept that we just saw with the DSM. Here, and what he spent most of his time studying was the emergence of negative emotional states. So he's emphasizing the negative effects of withdrawal. And he would state, as many people do, and I think Philip K. Dick's idea, he really emphasizes the withdrawal aspects to answer the question, what maintains drug use despite all of these negative consequences that are happening around the individual. So he focuses this punishment on the main character, who is Robert Arctor. I'm sorry, I can hear me coming. Can you guys hear? Is this okay? Thanks. And as you'll see, Robert Arctor, if you haven't seen the film or read the book, he is an undercover narcotics agent, and he has started with his job taking various drugs. This drug, substance D, is one of them. And as you'll see in the film, he'll have some challenges and ask himself in a number of ways, who am I, as things start to change. Well, what is substance D? It's in the book and the film. It goes also by the slang. The slang of death, slow death, is referred to D. According to the text, it is not a synthetic drug. It is derived from a plant with blue flowers, a very tiny plant. Its chemical name is Moore's ontologica, I guess, which apparently stands for death of the being. You see this. I took this as a screenshot. It's hard to see if you own this film. You can see it. It's too fast to see in the film, but you can slow it down, and there's all kinds of fascinating information like this that we later put in the film. Well, what are the behavioral pharmacological effects of substance D, according to Philip K. Dick? Like most drugs of abuse, intense euphoria up front. This engenders binge-like drug-taking behavior. Unlike other drugs of abuse, there's not a lot of wiggle room in terms of choice. Apparently, it is so euphoric and so potent in its abilities to change neurophysiology that you're going straight into addiction, heavy withdrawal. That's maintaining the behavior. Now it's producing psychosis, brain damage, and then death, hence the name. And it's automatic for most individuals. We'll talk about that in a minute, what kind of the sci-fi of that concept and the reality of that concept of what we know. One question, this is talked a lot about when you read Philip K. Dick, interviews with him in terms of his drug use, and probably the substance D, or it's conjectured that D also is an indication of his drug of choice, which was D-amphetamine and D-methamphetamine. So what are some similarities then? There are a lot of similarities. See on the left there, I'm showing you substance D and D-amphetamine as an example. And so both are psychoactive drugs of abuse. They're producing profound euphoria. They produce binge consumption-like behaviors, much like you probably hear about if you're interested in methamphetamines in the current discussion of drug addiction. They're, of course, both heavily addictive. They both produce the characteristic problems that are happening in the neurophysiology, which is tolerance to the drug, which increases, need more to get the same effect. Chasing that, profound withdrawal, and of course drug craving and that withdrawal state. Both of these drugs induce psychoses. And so I don't want to give too much away here, but stimulant-induced psychosis is fairly common. It's been reported for a long time. Clinically, it's been known for a long time. Usually when you hear of this, it's amphetamine, methamphetamine, or cocaine-induced psychosis. So this is not going to occur if you recreationally use Adderall, which is all D-amphetamine anyway. Okay, if you go through the oral route of administration, first pass metabolism, you're not going to get brain levels that can induce these neurotoxic effects. That's not to say you can't take enough of those pills to get very high levels of amphetamine in the brain. Generally, when you're talking about people who use routes of administration that make the compound 100% bioavailable. Smoking it, putting it right on lung, directly into brain, putting it in a vein, so going intravenously, 100% bioavailable to brain. It bypasses the liver the first time around, and then metabolism starts. So in those routes, you're able to get very high concentrations of drug into the brain. So one of the classic example that you hear about, you can read about a lot, is a concept called formication. And these are individuals who have this sensation that they have bugs primarily underneath their skin, tiny bugs crawling underneath their skin, and bugs crawling on you. You see people itch and scratch their skin and all kinds of different types of things that go along with that. And stimulant-induced psychosis, the psychosis is temporary. When people come to emergency rooms, and if they're not honest about what they've been doing, they can present as an individual who has schizophrenia. That is the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, hallucinations, delusions. And it's hard to tell that apart. The difference is that with the substance-induced psychosis, it subsides after your body does its work metabolizing the drug. So it's lasting as long as you have these high amounts of the drug in the brain. Now, the final point is that there's evidence that D-amphetamine, methamphetamine, and analogs of these compounds produce some neurotoxicity. Again, these are studies that are done generally with animal models that present very high doses for a very long time to try to understand what the mechanisms of the toxic effects that could be happening in the human brain. And here with stimulant-induced neurotoxicity, again, the big players, D-amphetamine, D-methamphetamine, exclude cocaine from this, has a different mechanism of action than the amphetamine-like stimulants, and does not get levels up really high enough to produce these toxic types of effects that you see with the amphetamines. And again, this is due to high levels from consumption into the brain. Now, differently than the concepts that are thrown around the movie, we're not talking about toxicity that is really specific to a major structure in the brain. It really is only occurring in dopamine synapses. And that's not just a small area. There are a fair amount of places in the brain those are. But this is in contrast to what Philip K. Dick is using as an example when he's talking about substance D-induced neurotoxicity. And what is really interesting, again, from a kind of a scientific and mechanism point of view, is that what he includes now is, and I showed you that list of things that are happening here at the end with brain damage prior to death. What he's telling us is that, first of all, again, all of his stuff is based off the science of the time. That's common science fiction writers, I understand. But as knowing the history and teaching this stuff, it's interesting to see probably how interested that he was. The comments all throughout the text are right on for 77. And so what he's done is taken Roger Sperry's work. Roger Sperry won a Nobel Prize for understanding the function of the hemispheres, and one of those things is how the information is transferred from hemisphere to hemisphere. The main route that happened is through the corpus callosum, which is shown here. And some of the discussion that you'll hear in the film, he's basically talking about a very specific mechanism here of the amphetamines deteriorating and working on this corpus callosum. So to the question, it's very interesting, who am I really? This puts our characters who are using the drug in an interesting place, because theoretically you're severing, you're splitting this kind of gestalt idea of information being passed back and forth, creating this unified experience that we're having. There's a statement in the film where Bob Arctor says that it is the perceptual faculties that are messed up, but the cognitive faculties are intact. So what that means is normal processing, no transfer of information, some kinds of competing information. The person, yet again, asking, who am I in that sense, as the process goes on and on. So the science fiction aspects of this, he's taken these common compounds, ones that he knew a lot, the science of the time, and remember that he experienced himself, had addiction problems with this, and in this author's note, he also mentions that the folks that you see around him are his friends as well. They're not directly his friends. If you know the text and know the film, Jerry Fabin doesn't make it into Linklater's adaptation, but Luckman was a friend of his who was a drug addict and had a lot of problems and committed suicide, he stated before that. So the social context is within his kind of domain and wheelhouse there as well. So there's some dissimilarities, and this is the interesting point where, yes, he's right on, but he takes it further and makes it really interesting. We don't know of any drugs that produce addiction following a single use. We heard a lot about that growing up. Dare, things like that, told us those types of things. But so much now is known about the physiological processes that underlie the behavior and the decision making. Things like tolerance, sensitization. These adaptations don't occur in one day. They don't occur from one bolus experience of a drug, even if it's IV, a high level. It takes time, and it's an interaction with the environment, decisions that are being made in real time. All of these things contribute to that. So it's interesting, but he kind of gives us a situation, I think, so that he can show us in the most extreme way what individuals, himself included, may have been up against. So he tells us that, in the second point, the character Barris is stated as saying, if you're not on substance D, then you haven't used it yet. You haven't tried it. So there is no drug that produces addiction in every single person. Think about it. Many of you have been around alcohol, drugs. Some of you may work in restaurants where these things are happening all the time. In college, you see people getting substances into their brain, alcohol, cigarettes included, that don't ever go on to have alcohol, nicotine problems, cocaine problems. On the whole, the studies from National Institute of Drug Abuse, it looks like about 10% across all categories of drugs, individuals who go on to have chronically relapsing lifetimes of drug addiction types of problems. And so I'll show you a figure. This is from Gene Hayman's book from 2009. What he did is he took large samples, see, 67,000 people, and that federal sample, and then 43,000 here, showing one study on ever used, the dark bars, which are hard to see, ever addicted. What I'm showing here on the left is percentage to use and percentage who are addicted, and this is by class of drug. These are just categories. They could have arranged this anyway, but it looks better going this way naturally. But it shows a very interesting and, I'll stand over here, important relationship there. If you look at any illicit drug, this excludes cigarettes and alcohol, so the rates would be a little bit higher, but so let's just look at this first bar on the left. Approximately 50% of people report using an illicit drug. Look how many down below 5% are ever addicted. Okay, so now look at it through different classes of drugs. Pot, cocaine, amphetamines, heroin. First of all, the difference between ever used and ever addicted is great. It is decreasing based on the classification of the drugs. The opiates, heroin being the one that if you were going to recreationally use these and wonder if you could end up in this class of users, the opiates are probably the ones to stay away from. Look at the difference between those bars, that ratio of ever used, ever addicted. Even though general use, people reporting using heroin, there aren't that many relative to other drugs. Again, the ratio of becoming addicted and using opiates is very small. So all drugs are not the same in terms of their addictive qualities, and certainly not everyone who uses these. Now, National Institute of Drug Abuse, if you're interested, you can email me. There's a lot of information about this. They've tracked and studied groups of people who chip, who are chippers, that is, they recreationally use. They use rules with very addictive drugs, so not to get addicted. These are individuals who can smoke and use IV heroin recreationally. And there are sites out there that will tell you about the rules. This is not obviously promotion or negation, and honestly, these are, in the drug use and effects class I teach with the undergraduates at the university, I always have to make these statements because, they're just very neutral types of things. But if you look at sites like Heroin Helper, where they want to protect people and that have heroin addiction and help them, there is a chipper tips pull down on there that tells you the rules that most people use. And the frequency is very low, so as not to, very spaced apart. And anyway, lots of different rules there. So the point is, even if you use IV heroin recreationally, that doesn't mean that the next day you're going to go through full-blown withdrawal and then start drug seeking and go through the transformations you'll see in the film. But just to summarize, Philip K. Dick, I believe, understood and included the knowledge of addiction science up to that time in the mid to late 70s. He creates a drug, though, that is unlike anything else. And it's unlike that because remember what Bear says. If you're not on it, you haven't used it. So use it once. It's unforgiving. And that's an interesting point that I think he's trying to make, that in terms of the punishment, the changes that happen to people, what he says is happening to his friends, he basically is creating a drug that puts them in a tragic predicament. And we can come up with various scenarios, but one way to look at it is this. Ultimately, these individuals, if they make the choice to quit, then experience extreme withdrawal. If they get through that, then you hear conversations in this text about, well, how boring is life at that point, right? I mean, you're not, life after using drugs that are this potent and this euphoric and life-changing, a lot of people report just it's very boring after that and quitting. So if you're able to do that and handle that, the point is to avoid further brain damage and death. This is the contingency that he's setting up, right? Or the choice is to avoid withdrawal, maintain use, because it's hard to quit, and there are great things about that. Aspects of drug use that people who show drug addiction will admit that they like and will miss, but then experience brain damage and death. And that is the contingency that he's really setting up with this drug, Substance D, again, that has no reality except for its relation somewhat to D-amphetamines. And so you'll see various scenes here with Bob Arctor asking this question, the theme of our series. Who am I? He is, has this, he's going to see these changes really through his career, issues with independence, duty, even love, and the social context that builds up around him of trust and mistrust. This is a very rich and complicated text. Linklater's film addresses many of those things. And if you haven't read the book, I would suggest that. If you're interested, you can email me. There are a lot of other interesting stories that are like this. I would suggest William Burroughs' Junkie, things like that. This is, if you like this stuff, a very similar idea. Well, the last thing that I'll point you to is just that Linklater includes this author's note that is a truncated version of it at the end, which is really cool because it's about three pages long in the text. But what to look for when you see the name Phil, if you're staying around for that, he's including himself in this this list of people that some are deceased that are his friends and have all kinds of problems from this behavior and his metaphor of playing in the street. And so, thank you very much for your attendance and listening there. I hope that these have been points that will make the film a little bit more interesting. And it's very interesting to begin with. Thank you, Andy, and to the Nickelodeon for inviting me, and enjoyed the film there.